Hello, everybody, and welcome to What Would Your Ideal World Be? A podcast which examines very fascinating people, the topics that they care about, and most importantly, what their ideal world would be. If you like what you see here, please like, share, and subscribe. This is a special episode covering the City of Chester by-election. Today's guest is the Rejoin EU Party candidate, Richard Hewison. Hewison has been involved in politics since the 1980s while fighting for LGBT rights, and has been the leader of the Rejoin EU Party since its founding in February 2020. Hewison was a previous guest on this show in 2021 when he was standing in the old Bexley Sidcup by-election, where he came 8th. That episode will be linked in the description down below. The by-election itself will occur on the 1st of December. Thank you for coming on, and I'll just get right into the questions.
Perfect.
Sure, yeah. So the first question I wanted to ask you, and it's similar to the one I asked you the last time when you were here. You have just been elected as the MP for the City of Chester, and you just
I wish.
hypothetically, and you just entered Parliament for the first time. What is the first major policy objective that you seek to achieve while there, and who will you work with in order to achieve that goal?
Well, that's a very good question. And let's say the people of Chester were to put their faith in me to represent them for the next 2 years in Parliament. One of the things I do believe very strongly is it is the role of the MP to make sure that the constituents' concerns are voiced in Parliament. And having been round Chester already and talked to quite a few people, I am aware of quite a few local and national issues there. For example, the funding of the local hospital is a really, really key thing in Chester. That is certainly something I would want to highlight in my role as an MP. But let's not ignore the fact I'm standing as a Rejoin EU Party candidate. So at the end of the day, I am going to be linking the problems that people are finding, not just all over the country, but particularly in Chester as well, as a result of us leaving the European Union.
Mm-hmm. And how bad is if you don't mind me asking, about the underfunding of that hospital in the local area, especially since, if you don't mind me pointing out, the area's been Labour represented for quite a while now, but it's been underrepresented. So the hospital's been underfunded. How's that been allowed to happen? I wonder, if you don't mind me.
Well, this is an interesting question. Many people have concerns that the Countess is the name of the local hospital is under threat. And certainly the outgoing MP said that he would fight with the last drop of his blood to save the hospital.
That went well.
Well, it did. And fortunately, the hospital is still there at the moment. And it's certainly one of the issues that I'm going to be looking at very closely when I talk to the constituents going around the constituency in the next few weeks.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of the former MP, I don't want to name them because of the whole, controversy they've been involved with.
Indeed.
But have there been any sort of similar sort of complaints regarding his behaviour, not in terms of what he's resigned for, but just in general for not being a particularly good constituency MP? And if so, is that...
On the contrary, I have to say, Edward, the people I've spoken to in Chester, most of them have reacted with horror, sadness, and overwhelming disappointment. Most people had a very, very good impression of their outgoing MP. And it has to be said, in terms of the vote Labour had there, in 2019, whilst the Labour vote, of course, as we know, was going down in most places, it actually went up in Chester. So he had appeared to be a very good constituency MP.
Mm-hmm. And do you think possibly one thing that may help you in this by-election is the fact that you talk about the fact that this guy was a good constituency MP and therefore the Labour vote in the area increased because of that? Do you think with him outgoing, the possibility could be that a lot of the goodwill people had towards him in terms of that vote may deplete, and that may benefit candidates such as yourself?
It's possible. I have to say, I think the anger with the government is palpable by most people that I've spoken to in Chester. And indeed, very few people have expressed to me outrage at their MP's behaviour, although a few people have talked to me about how disappointed they are with Labour's policy proposals overall at the moment. In terms of the critics that I've spoken to on the street, I'd say they probably break 2/3 being very critical of the government and 1/3 being very critical of the Labour opposition. So certainly it's possible. I mean, there's 9 candidates in this election, and I think the Conservative vote will go down. I think the Labour vote, I don't know, obviously it's a by-election, so turnover will be down. It may kind of hold about steady with counterbalancing forces, maybe go down a bit. Where the other 7 candidates benefit from that, of course, is anybody's guess at this stage.
Mm-hmm. When it comes to discussing discontent with the government in not only Chester but in other areas as well, when it comes specifically, Chester, what are sort of the main gripes that people have with the government in terms of like what's currently going on in Britain right now?
Well, fear, quite frankly, fear over the future for themselves and their families, and that fear coming from three basic directions. Obviously, unaffordable mortgages and house prices as a result of the disastrous Truss budget. And I think people are starting to realise that although the Truss budget was a huge blunder, the underlying pressure on interest rates is up, and this is going to be a problem people are going to have to face sooner or later. Then, of course, the second fear is the energy bills. How are they going to keep warm this winter? Will vulnerable people be, well, let's be honest, some vulnerable people this winter may make sad decisions which result in them suffering from hypothermia, being hospitalized, and potentially even worse. So that's the second big fear. And of course, the third big fear is the rise of prices on the food that they're putting on their plates. Everyone can see supermarket prices going up. Everyone's feeling the pinch there, and it's becoming an impossible balancing act for many. And indeed, if we go back a few years, you might remember Theresa May and her jams, the just about managings. Nobody who was just about managing a few years ago stands a hope at the moment in the current circumstances if they're in the same economic position they were then. So this is where to coin a Clintonism, it's the economy stupid. Is very much what people are saying at the moment.
Beyond any of that, what are there any other main issues that have been raised so far during your campaign in terms of local constituency issues beyond the stuff you mentioned before with the hospital?
I think there was a e-bike experiment recently in Chester, and a number of people are quite concerned about the safety on the streets of e-bikes being given the license in Chester to go full throttle. Excuse the pun. And I think that has certainly concerned a few people. There is hopefully, there's a reasonable body of evidence from the trial that hasn't been put in the public domain yet, but will be soon. And I think many people are a bit nervous about it becoming full time. I think that's something that Chester's going to have to look at very carefully.
And is that a similar fear in terms of around just these sort of e-vehicles in general, whether they be e-scooters or e-bikes? Is it just sort of like a just similar concern, or is it just very specific to Chester in terms of the e-bikes?
Very specific to Chester from what I can see. It's not something that anyone's ever approached me about anywhere else that I've been campaigning. In fairness, obviously that was Bexley last year and the Mayor of London earlier last year, and some of the other campaigns I have colleagues on. It's the first time this particular issue has come up on the street.
And what do you think it is then that local national governments, especially people like Grant Shapps and so on, have embraced stuff like e-scooters and e-bikes as sort of like the future of transport? And admittedly, I should know, being in here and just outside Bishop Stortford, we have quite a lot of e-scooters around. They make me dreadfully nervous.
I have to say, at the risk of sounding partisan here, why does a Tory minister support anything? A lot of we're hearing today about the Australia trade deal, which was told to be so wonderful and turned out to be something that was actually a dog's breakfast when it was actually negotiated, and most people in the government were aware of it. So these days, when I hear any minister from the government saying that something is a terrific idea, I call me suspicious. I just wonder where that's coming from. And I can't read Grant Shapps' mind, fortunately.
Fair enough. Which is weird because I remember about like 10 years ago nearly the whole controversy around hoverboards and stuff like that.
Oh, yes.
But e-scooters, which have been linked to, a lot of controversy, especially in Paris from what I hear, are, given the green light, whereas the other thing was immediately banned. I just find that a bit strange. On the Australian trade deal you discussed, like what are the main issues concerning that, and how could that badly, negatively impact your potential constituents in Chester?
Well, obviously, Chester's quite a sort of mixed constituency. The city of Chester itself is a very thriving metropolis and a holiday destination, but there's farms just outside. And of course, many farmers have been very adversely affected by the Australian-New Zealand trade deal, pretty much throwing them under the bus, to be quite honest, in terms of trying to get a political win at the time, it now appears. And I think that there are many concerns that when, during the Brexit referendum, farmers were told by Vote Leave and Conservative campaigners that they were very valued and essential to Britain's future, now they feel they've been just sort of regarded as disposable, pretty much like our Fisher fleet were about a year ago, when some of the details of the deals that we were getting into with the European rights for fishing in our waters became clear.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that it's just more of an extension of sort of like the militant free tradism within a lot of the Conservative Party ranks, where they'll throw any major sort of British workforce under the bus for the sake of cheap produce from Australia, whatever it may be, or is it more of a different issue?
I have to be honest with you, Edward. I don't think so. I think there are so many ways, if you were really pro free trade, you could actually go about it. And indeed, if we were to put aside political capitalism with a small c, just trying to take advantage of situations and moods, it would be relatively easy to make broad open offers to the world in terms of trade if we were really serious about promoting free trade. But that was not what Brexit was about, and it's certainly not what it's delivering.
Mm-hmm. And the next question I wanted to ask you is that you were discussing this just a little bit earlier, actually. What has running for previous elections, most recently the old Bexley-Sidcup by-election, helped to teach you about such campaigns, and how have you adopted such tactics this time round?
Well, what every campaign has taught me so far is that there will be an unhelpful intervention that prevents you campaigning. With my mayoral campaign, we were all under lockdown at the time, with very, very few exceptions, and it was very, very restricted what we could do. And then, of course, in Bexley, halfway through the campaign, Omicron variant suddenly struck, and of course, not all parties did, but we decided to suspend activities 2 weeks out from the actual election there, which of course would have cost us a lot of votes. So the one thing I am looking forward to with Chester is actually being able to run a full campaign and actually see, when we do have volunteers out on streets, knocking on doors, talking to people, how many votes we can actually achieve. That's going to be a very interesting for me.
Mm-hmm. And on that, talking about the differences of campaigning, how does it feel so far to be running a more fully fledged campaign this time around, not hampered back by pandemic restrictions and stuff like that?
It feels very good, to be honest with you. Also, it's not just the pandemic as well. This one's been quite different in nature, in that with this campaign, obviously, when we found out about the by-election, we were, oh, there's a by-election, should we stand? And before we'd even started talking about it, some people from Chester had approached us saying, look, we really think you should put up a candidate here. People are realizing what a con Brexit is. Rejoining the EU is going to be one of the best things we can do to boost our economy. And they put their money where their mouth is. They were willing to fund the deposit of our candidate if they stood in the area. We've never had a proactive approach like that before. And so, of course, that was very encouraging.
Mm-hmm. And why do you think you managed to get that sort of like proactive response in this circumstance? Do you think it's because the city of Chester itself is a more pro EU sort of area, or is it just the fact that actually people are a little bit angry with how things are going with Brexit so far than in other places?
I think the latter, really, because Chester was not. Chester was right on the border, 50.5 in favour of Leave, 49.5 in favour of Remain, by one measure, just looking at the constituency and the surrounding area. Although another measure looking at the city itself gave it a 57% Remain criteria. I think people are just angry at the way things have happened. I think people who did vote for Brexit kind of fall into three camps at the moment. One camp is those who realised they were conned and that all the promises made, no one had any intention of delivering in the first place. The second camp still believes that Brexit was a very good idea, but that the current people that are administering it are utterly incompetent, and that's why it's been a failure. And those people as well think perhaps, I don't know what they would do if there was a new referendum, they'd probably be on the fence. And then, of course, there is the third camp who, despite all the problems that we've had with Brexit, will still cheer it up to the hilt. Other than cabinet ministers and a few random people who say the same things as cabinet ministers, there aren't many of those, but I've met a few in Chester.
Mm-hmm. I was about to say, you're meeting sort of these people. How often have you bumped into Brexit voters, so to speak, in that area, and how has it been like talking to them? And have you convinced any to vote for you, for instance?
There are two that stand out so far that I've met on the street. One, a very, very hard Labour gentleman. When I say hard Labour, I mean very, very passionate Labour supporter, and what we would call a Lexiter there.
Sure.
Very pro-Labour, very pro-Brexit, very, very keen on it. Quite happy to admit the problems of Brexit, but still thinks it's a good idea. I had quite a robust debate with him. I didn't change his mind, but certainly we discussed a few issues. And then there was another couple who were just a little bit abusive, to be quite honest. And, you know,
How
to a certain
charming.
extent, you just sort of, well, I can always give as good as I get in situations like that. But, just started shouting, oh, you're a bad loser, you don't respect democracy, you know, that sort of thing, which you get occasionally. But I always think it's quite a weak argument to tell a candidate in a democratic election that they don't believe in democracy. I think that argument kind of falls at the first hurdle, really.
And especially now, I would say, especially because the things happen, and now that's up, in the air again for people to stand on all the rest of it. And the next question I want to ask you, funnily enough, on that front, is in July of this year, the Rejoin EU Party gained its first elected representative,
Yes.
the chairman Andrew Smith, with him being elected onto the parish council at, if I butchered the name, I'm sorry, Goring-on-Thames in
Boring
Oxford.
indeed. Yes.
What does that speak to in terms of your party support, and how do you plan to replicate that electoral success yourself in this
Well,
by-election?
that's a very good question. Now, the timing, of course, was crucial here because if we think back to that time period, it's when Brexit was starting to fall apart a little bit at the wheels. The Johnson government was being revealed to be quite shady, and there was a number of very, very dubious issues. From memory, I don't think we'd quite reached the stage of the Pincher affair at that particular point, but people were starting to get really, really grumpy with the government. Obviously, when you can say, okay, Brexit's not working, we need to do something about it. If you've got an opposition that say, oh, Brexit's safe with us, we're going to embrace Brexit, we're going to make Brexit work, it's kind of met with cynicism. So I think Andrew started standing on the Rejoin EU label, tapped into a nice sense of feeling in the area. And obviously, in elections like that, turnouts are not as high as we would perhaps hope. And that, of course, means a moderately large group of angry people can go to the polls and elect a candidate.
Fair enough. And how do you feel? You're talking about following up the Chris Pincher stuff, and led to Boris Johnson's resignation. Funnily enough, Pincher being the only member of the government not to resign despite everything that happened. But on that front, you talk about Boris Johnson's government being shady. How do you feel that, even now there are Red Wall MPs, Tory MPs in those areas, most known to be Miriam Cates, who wrote in the Telegraph recently about how she wouldn't have supported Johnson's comeback. Why do you think that most of the Tory party, at least in terms of the parliamentary party, have turned on him now, given how, well, notably shady he was even when he was elected initially? People knew about this stuff.
Do you know, I think psychologists can write books on this for years to come. It's unfortunate because being the heart of the government, it paralyzes everything we do when you have a group of Tory MPs who are all following their own version of game theory, trying to guess how each other's going to play and what's going to be most beneficial for them. And what actually gets you to that particular tipping point is, of course, something which is very, very hard to judge. Because for me, things like the affair with, I forget his name now, Patterson, that's it.
Yes.
And his expenses, and sort of overriding the decision of the disciplinary committee and preventing him being suspended from Parliament was the most outrageous act of democratic fraud, really, which really exposed the weakness of our system. And I do wonder sometimes if some Tory MPs, out of loyalty, will do the really unthinkable, such as back that. My local Tory MP had the misfortune to knock on my door that weekend and ask me for my support. So got a reasonable earful about the Owen Patterson affair at that particular stage. But I think it's things like that that just make people feel, you know what? I've given you the benefit of the doubt for so long. I've ignored this, that, the other. I've ignored the reckless approach to COVID. I've ignored the corruption with some of the expenses. I've ignored when you wouldn't prioritize giving children free school meals. But this is the straw that breaks the back. And when you see a couple of people breaking cover, I think Rishi Sunak resigning and there was another, I forget who it was, who resigned at the same time, actually sparked perhaps a bit of a cascade.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think about who that was, but I just, I'm blanking on it myself as well. So, well, someone did, and that happened. So we can say that with certainty.
Yeah.
How do you feel about the fact that there are still people to this day? I mean, I watched a debate about this a little while ago. People
Mm.
to this day within the party and outside of it who still defend Johnson and all the rest of it, and were very excited about his comeback despite him having broken the law. Why do you think there still is that sort of support around him? And what do you think this speaks to when it comes to certain elements of British politics?
Because it's the ultimate fantasy comeback movie, isn't it? Disgraced politician doing the unthinkable. Wouldn't it be funny to rub all their noses in it to elect him again? And I have absolutely no doubt that if it had gone down to a vote of the Conservative Party, Boris Johnson would have been back. And the reason I think most Conservatives would have given for voting for Johnson in that instance was simply to see the look on the faces of all the so-called moral, upstanding brigade as they hauled him back into Downing Street. I think we're at quite a dangerous point in the evolution of our democracy, and I think whilst Rishi Sunak, all his trust, could potentially prove perhaps not the end of the Conservative Party, but a long wilderness for the Conservative Party. I think if Boris Johnson had been returned to power, it could have ended probably with chaos at the heart of our parliamentary system. It would have exposed the corrupt underbelly with no safeguards or checks to such a person taking office. And I think at that stage, the British people en masse would have got very, very uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm. I mean, yeah, you talk about being like a film. I mean, yeah, to be fair, I did see how Citizen Kane ended, and it didn't end in Kane's favor, shall we say. But the next thing I wanted to ask you was that this is you said, what can you offer left-wing voters, if you don't mind me saying, in this area, or Liberal voters, that other left-wing parties like Labour and the Green Party cannot?
Very good question. Well, one thing I can offer that neither the Lib Dem and the Green Party cannot offer, because they've shown they cannot offer it, I will never, ever, ever, whilst this Conservative leader with this Conservative government is in place, use any votes the Rejoin EU Party have to support Conservatives in office. And quite frankly, when I see in councils around the country, the Lib Dems and the Green Party allowing the Conservatives to take chairs of very important committees, I think it's a betrayal to their voters, quite frankly, and that's one thing people can be assured from us.
Mm-hmm. What do you think those councils in those specific areas do that then? Is it just for the sake of, I don't know, council unity or whatever, or just wanting to not kick the cart too much?
Well, I don't want to be London-centric, but I'll use the example of London. You might recall London has an assembly of 25 members.
Mm.
It has 11 Labour members, and of course you need 13 to have a majority, so Labour have to cooperate. And I get the impression that after the election, Labour were very arrogant and just basically wanted to say, right, we've won, we need to have these, you need to come on board. You can't possibly side with the Tories, so you have to side with us. And the Greens and the Lib Dems, I think, made the mistake of their life in siding with the Conservatives to give them the chair of many important committees. For example, giving the Conservatives the chair of the Police and Crime Commission in London. At the time, the Metropolitan Police is investigating crime at the centre of a Conservative government in Downing Street, was a severe conflict of interest. And whilst I understand that it might have been a bit politically expedient to do that, I'm appalled that the Greens and the Lib Dems have not said no, we can't have a Conservative chair on that committee, but have stuck by this shabby, shady deal. That's one thing you'll never get from us.
Mm-hmm. Do you think they do that as well in order to sort of like stick it to the other left-wing groups, so to speak, that they're more interested in fighting amongst themselves and proving to be top dog rather than unity for the best of it?
I think you may have something there. I think to a certain extent, perhaps the Greens and the Lib Dems were happy to put Labour on the naughty stool in the London Assembly just to sort of demonstrate that. But again, when you have local politicians following exactly the national rhetoric on things like immigration, things like Brexit, things like PR, to actually support such councillors to take seats, I think is beyond the pale. And again, I know it sounds like the same old line, but if we were to elect a hung parliament with Lib Dems holding the balance of power, surely they would support a Labour SNP coalition, Well, we know from 2010 that that's not necessarily the case. And we also know that we could even get them to sign a pledge before the election saying that they wouldn't support the Conservatives. And we know how much those pledges count for because the current leader signed such a pledge and then breached it in 2010. So this, I think, is one of the areas that we can offer a much sort of cleaner sheet, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, that paid so much dividends for them in the end because now look how little representation they have in Parliament and so on.
Mm.
But one thing I wanted to touch on that you brought up earlier, you were talking about, if you don't mind me asking, which was this Tory MP who badgered you about how great Boris Johnson was? You were discussing that earlier. If I could acquire
The Tory MP,
the local one, you said.
Oh, that's well. I'm in Barnet, so you won't have to work very hard to look it up and find that Teresa Villiers is my MP, and she knocked on the door asking me, "Hi, I'm your local MP, Conservative MP. Could we rely on your vote in the council election next June?" And I was perfectly polite. I just said, "Oh yes, you are, aren't you? You're the one that recently voted for Mr. Owens to get away from Mr. Patterson to get away from his punishment. I think you'd better put me down as a no." She did look quite disheveled, and I think she'd probably had quite a rough time on our street at that particular time, which she might not have expected because I think it looks a bit like a Tory street, but you soon find out it's not.
Especially that area, which I think, if I'm not mistaken, I know the area you talk about because I have relatives who actually live in that area as well, which is becoming more and more Labour over time, which I'm not sure what that speaks to, but it speaks to something, I'm sure. And the next question I wanted to ask you also is that given how the seat you're running in is a safe Labour, well, we discussed that and so on, and has been since the Blair years, how do you plan to win over such voters to your side? You've already given some details, but in specifically Labour's case.
Well, specifically Labour's case, it's because there are many people who are instinctively Labour supporters who know what Keir Starmer's talking about at the moment is a load of rubbish. That if Keir Starmer is elected in 20, and let's be honest, that's where the smart money is. Keir Starmer will become Prime Minister in January 2025. Unless something radical happens with the polls, it will be an overall majority, and he's going to try and spend from 2025 to 2030 making Brexit work. It's not going to happen, and voters know it's not going to happen. Now, voters in Chester can choose in 2022 to send a soft message to their leader. Every single vote that they don't give to Labour in a by-election that won't change anything in terms of the country will show their leader how they feel. So we offer ourselves as an unambiguous vehicle to say Brexit is not working. And if you believe Brexit's not working, every vote for us tells Keir Starmer that that is directly what you believe. And I think there's still hope for Keir Starmer, to be quite honest. We have two more Labour conferences potentially before the next election, 2023, 2024. If he gets the message loudly and clearly and strongly enough, he could go into the 2025 general election with a very powerful Labour message and offering on our relationship with the European Union. And even if you don't agree with me that rejoining the EU is the way forward, by voting for my party, you state clearly that the European Union and our relationship to it is an issue that needs to be addressed. So that's what I would say to Labour voters.
Mm-hmm. And on that front, you talk about Keir Starmer and all the rest of it. From the sort of polling I've seen and so on and so forth, it seems I could be wrong about this, that Keir Starmer, so far not being necessarily particularly popular himself, is seen as the better than the other guy. What do you think that speaks to in terms of our current politics when it's sort of like a pick your poison contest when it comes to these sort of things?
Well, I'm reminded very, very much of the situation in 94, 95, 96. And just to sort of briefly, for those of your listeners who weren't around then and weren't familiar with it, in 1992, John Major's new government did a boo-boo almost on the scale of Liz Truss's mini budget. They crashed the pound, they pushed interest rates up to 15% in an afternoon before having to admit failure, devalue the pound and get interest rates back to a more reasonable level. And the electorate never forgot it. From 92 to 97, it really didn't matter what else happened. People had lost their trust in the economic competence of this government. And of course, at the time, Labour was led by John Smith, and everyone expected John Smith to become the next leader. And tragically, John Smith died of a heart attack in 94, and then, of course, Tony Blair took over. But in actual fact, by that stage, it was almost a blank check. People didn't really care whether it was John Smith or Tony Blair who became Prime Minister. It was different from this government. And obviously, Tony Blair won a huge landslide in 97. He could have done it on a more aggressive agenda. He would not have lost the election on a more aggressive agenda, and it would have given him the authority to change Britain at a faster pace after that. And I think we're in the same situation now, where there is a blank check to the Labour Party. And unless I can't think what Keir Starmer could possibly say, do, or promise that would tip things back in the Tories' favour at this stage.
Maybe he says that actually Liz Truss's budget, in his eyes, wasn't that bad after all. It just wasn't, neoliberal enough. Maybe he could say that. I don't know. Pigs fly.
Well, this is the thing. He's actually saying, oh, yeah, Brexit's dreadful, but it's going to be great under us. I'm not going to tell you how, but it's going to be fantastic under us. And people are going, oh, okay, yeah, and follow. So again, if Keir Starmer was to turn around tomorrow and say, you know what, she might not have done it very well, but Liz Truss basically had the right idea, I think a lot of people would still go, oh yeah, okay, yeah, fair enough. Poor old Liz. And follow along. I hope he's not going to do that, but it would be an interesting social experiment. Perhaps we'll get him to do it on April the 1st, make the announcement, so he can row back in the afternoon and say, no, just joking.
Indeed. And the next question to that as well, I mean, you're talking about Brexit in relation to Labour. In relation to that, I remember reading this in the Chester Standard, researching this. This might be just been admittedly a press release. You stated that your candidacy was in part to challenge Labour leader Keir Starmer's Make Brexit Work policy and in turn, quote unquote, show Labour where their priorities lie. Given the Labour Party's previous Remain stance, especially that of Starmer himself, why do you think that they have ran away from the EU issue?
Naked electoral opportunism, to be honest. This is something that I have to say, I'm getting quite old in the tooth now, but I'm constantly disappointed by this. Anytime you think that there's a politician who actually cares about a particular issue, you can then watch them pivot 180 degrees on that issue and suddenly move in the reverse direction. And I have to say, there are a few Labour MPs that stand out to me as being, fairly integral in terms of not having changed their views, always stood for the same sort of principles and issues and moving on in the same direction. But Keir Starmer's about turn really does disappoint me, I think I would say.
And do you think maybe one reason he has, U-turned massively on that issue is because he's cynically trying to gain clout among, especially we talk about the former Red Wall and stuff like that turned Tory in the last election mainly on that issue, or in other cases, him being heckled at conferences about, his Brexit policy being the reason they're out of power, all this sort of stuff. Do you think him being nervous of, provoking the wrath of such people is the reason that essentially that he's, cowering on this issue?
I think it probably is. And also, I think Labour is too hypnotised by the 2019 election to learn the lessons of the 2017 election as well. Now, the 2017 election was, as you might recall, a dead heat. Nationally, Theresa May kept in office by less than 1,000 votes in strategic seats across the country there against Jeremy Corbyn, whereas in 2019, of course, Jeremy Corbyn was absolutely wiped out. Now, there wasn't massively different positions that Labour had on Brexit at that stage. It was all to do with hatred of Jeremy Corbyn. And a lot of the loss of the 2019 election was because Jeremy Corbyn is someone I have a certain amount of respect for, but I do feel that he let the media walk all over him a little bit. He didn't come out and challenge a lot of the things that were said about him, much of which was exaggeration, if not outright lies. I think he chose to keep the dignified silence and think that the public would rise above it. Well, they didn't. And that, I think, is the biggest reason for the loss of the 2019 election. I'm pretty sure that most Labour leaders, or most potential Labour leaders, could have taken that manifesto into the 29 election and got a very different result. It was very personal, that election.
Do you think in the case of discussing Jeremy Corbyn then, could it be the fact, because I actually had friends who supported him at the time, but felt he was very terrible when it came to the media. Do you think the problem is, and this is not someone who's, supported Jeremy Corbyn or whatever, but even though I agree with you that I have some sort of respect for him, do you think that the problem is he was a bit too civil in an age and an era of politics which is a lot more aggressive and, confrontational?
It's interesting. I'm not sure civility is the issue. I think it's addressing the issues that the media are putting to you. Now, I'm not going to comment on the rights or wrongs of it, but Jeremy Corbyn was a lifelong anti-racist campaigner, absolute lifelong anti-racist campaigner. He was painted as anti-Semitic in the run-up to the 2019 election. And I know, speaking to a lot of Jewish people, they were generally afraid of what would happen if Jeremy Corbyn was elected. Now, I'm not going to comment on whether he is or whether he isn't. I've not seen overwhelming evidence. There's one or two things he said that have made me a bit uncomfortable, but no sort of smoking gun there. But he didn't address the issue, and the public deserved to hear his defense of that particular accusation. And that is where I think he made his biggest mistake.
Mm-hmm. Reverting to a completely different issue now, in terms of being a pro-EU candidate, I mean, you were talking about the sort of the constituency vote, and that's what I'm going to go with in terms of the city one specifically. So if I'm wrong, you can moan at me later. Does being a pro-EU candidate help you to court support in a constituency? This is what I looked at last night. I'm not sure if the data's accurate. That voted, I think, as you said, 57% to remain in the bloc.
Potentially, yes. It's very polarizing, of course. As an issue, it still galvanizes opinions. More people came rushing up to us when they could see we had an EU flag and we're doing our nomination paper in a positive way than rushed up to us in a negative way, I would say. And that has generally been the experience in many areas. One of the things I do find, though, in fact, this actually happened in the Chesham and Amersham by-election, because our rosette is blue with the yellow stars on it, and I tend to, I'm a middle-aged white guy that wears a suit, people often assume that I'm the Tory candidate. And I had one very angry gentleman come running up to me at Chesham and just got right into my face, pointing, what the Tories have done to the NHS is an absolute disgrace. I just looked at him and said, yes, I know. He said, well, what are you going to do about it? I said, nothing, I'm not a Tory. And he was, oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. You do get extreme reactions, but only often when you're mistaken for people in another party.
Mm-hmm. And what does that speak to when you're getting, viciously confronted like that? Do you think that speaks to a decline of civility in politics as a whole? Because, I might have my opinions, but I'm not going to go and run up to someone and do that because that's just really aggressive, man. Gee.
It was quite aggressive. Yes, I had much more aggressive than that in Bexley. There was because as you might remember, a year ago we had the same issue with lots of boats coming over and the RNLI rescuing people. And some lady came up to me very, very angry. Well, actually, two ladies came up to me and both said exactly the same thing. They both said to me, what would you do about the immigrant problem? And well, what would you do about the boats? And I replied, well, I'd make sure that they were safely landed, give them warm food and water, and the space to hear their asylum claim taken seriously. And from the outside, both of these ladies seemed exactly the same. One of them turned to me and said, well, thank goodness someone's talking compassion and sense in this. The other one referred to me very loudly as a female reproductive organ, beginning with C, and walked down the street shouting that word several times in a very, very loud voice to the amusement of most people that were watching. So you can never tell sometimes when an interaction starts.
Yeah, the word that is a spoonerism on a certain, I think it's a Caravan album. I'm not going to say what it is. Let's just say it's a spoonerism in some sections. I'm not going to repeat it on air because I'm not. I don't want to.
People of our Chancellor at the moment. Let's
yes, or stuff like that. And on that, if you don't mind me asking, is just like how do you feel then about that issue specifically about the whole issue with boats coming over and stuff like that, and how does that tie into problems involving us leaving the EU, do you think, if you don't mind me asking?
Well, to be frank, I think it's a separate issue. And the reason I think it's a separate issue is because this is something that is going to continue and it is going to grow in numbers. We have a situation on our planet where we have fundamentally destabilized many of the geopolitical regimes to the south of Europe. At the same time, climate change is starting to have devastating effects on people in that area. Add to that the sort of wars in the southeastern regions of Europe and the underlying uncertainty, you are going to get people fleeing north. And let's be frank, people don't make the decision to suddenly abandon their life and move somewhere else for trivial reasons. There's got to be a fundamental underlying issue. And the numbers that are coming to the UK as immigrants or asylum seekers, whichever word, are not overwhelming at this stage. They are numbers that can be handled carefully, compassionately, and with the dignity that I hope the British legal system has, and they are not jeopardizing our underlying culture. We are a nation of close to 70 million. We're talking about five-figure numbers at the moment coming to this country.
Mm-hmm. And in relation to that, and it was announced in the Times today and several other outlets that there was a new deal between the British and the French governments in terms of putting people on either side and so on. Do you think that might get to a little bit more of a, more of a solution to the issue, or do you think it's just
No, I think it's again. Here's something where I kind of hope I'm proved wrong on this, but I think it's merely posturing and PR to satisfy both sides of the channel here in terms of the political agendas. I don't think it's going to have a very large effect, to be frank with you. And as I say, over the 20s and into the 30s, climate change is going to be devastating vast regions of our planet. It's going to accelerate this, and vast swathes of populations are going to need to move north. That is where we are. If we want to solve immigration, we have to deal with the underlying problems, and the underlying problems are climate change and the geopolitical instability in our world. Now, I would argue certainly for both of those, our best response is to be part of a bigger group of countries. So rejoining the EU, of course, would be not the solution, but the starting step on the solution. And again, I often get accused of being very pro-EU and anti-the UK. I'm not. I think the EU needs to step up its game on both climate change and its international foreign policy. And that's one of the reasons I want to be back in the EU, because I want us to be able to kick upwards and try and force the EU to have more proactive stances on both.
Mm-hmm. And funnily enough, that leads you very perfectly onto the next question, funnily enough. How do you feel about the government's moves, mainly under the 5 minutes of Liz Truss's premiership, in joining the permanent structured cooperation in relation to defence? And do you think this could be the first steps into Britain building a more cooperative relationship with the European Union as a whole?
Well, yes. I mean, it's almost as if we're searching for a group of like-minded countries in the same geographical area that we can join together and make political decisions with, which to me is just, it's the ultimate irony in the whole thing. Now, I genuinely wish the initiative well, because if it brings together, for political decision-making purposes, people who don't want to be united economically, then I think that's great in terms of leveraging things forward. But let's remember, most people, their reason for Brexiting was not economic, it was political. They did not want to be part of a big political club, but they quite like the economic benefits. So for many people, they sacrificed the economic benefits to get what they perceive as the political independence. And now if they're moving to, once again, relinquish some of the political independence and get back none of the economic benefits, I could understand why people would be deeply miffed by that particular outcome.
And how do you feel by the fact that the certain hardline Brexiteers, most notably Mark Francis, who was, one of the Spartans, or one of the people who kept voting down Theresa May's deal to the very end? How do you feel that there are people like him who support, who are against the European Union but support stuff like PESCO? What do you think that speaks to? In short, do you think is it just cynical opportunism?
I think it speaks to a mindset of people who never really wanted to make the decisions, but just wanted to seem angry and on the minority side, and accidentally won a vote that they never thought they were going to win in 2016, and are now trying to live with the consequences of it. So yes, political opportunism. The whole plan that was put forward by the Brexit side in 2016 was never very well thought out in the first place. I think they probably thought that if we ever do win, then we'll think it out, and they still really haven't thought it out properly. So I think in a way, it might be a sort of facing reality and trying to do it in a way without losing face.
Mm-hmm. Do you think the reason that they didn't, think it out so thoroughly is because they didn't think they were going to win, and they were just doing it as sort of a way to court certain voters that they thought that would, never vote for them otherwise, I suppose?
Absolutely. I think that is entirely the reason. I do not think there is a single Brexiteer who thought on the night of June 23rd, 2016, that they were actually going to win. I remember very clearly doing a little bit of a flutter on the financial markets with Brexit after the results closed. And there was a spread bet being offered on whether Britain would remain or leave. And after the polls had been closed for more than an hour, that spread bet was still showing a 92% probability of remaining in the EU. So very, very few people thought we were going to leave, including most of the Brexiteers as well, which is why I think they made such outrageous promises that they knew could never actually be kept. The problem is they captured the hearts and the imagination of many, many people who still believe those promises and find it difficult to accept that some of those promises were never going to happen.
Do you think this is why maybe in turn, like on the morning of June 24th, 2016, going back to Boris Johnson, funnily enough, and so on, like they looked a bit forlorn, like, oh, we've sort of, offered you a cake and now we don't know how we're going to, offer it up pretty much.
Very much so. I think, again, we often forget some of the reasons that people voted to leave in 2016. And one thing that I think is downplayed now, which was on the minds of many, many hundreds of thousands of voters, was it was a vote against David Cameron, the smug, arrogant prime minister who they didn't really like, even though he'd been re-elected. And it was a good way to stick a middle finger up at David Cameron, who, of course, resigned on the morning after the vote, and of course threw the Conservative Party into turmoil there. And that was the big news story that was coming out in the early days. Very few people even remember David Cameron now, it seems to appear. And so that particular motivation is lost to history.
And forgive me for sounding rather snotty here, but good riddance on his front, rather. But that's just maybe me being snotty and.
I'm disappointed. I thought you were politically neutral here.
Well, yeah, but we're not against people like him. Let's just say that. Anyway,
but again, I mean, and this, on a serious note, this is the problem with referenda in general. Referenda actually activate people on personalities rather than issues. And it's disappointing in our society that we have that. But being so closely associated with David Cameron, that was an issue. And the problem with Jeremy Corbyn, again, going back to 2019, I actually think Jeremy Corbyn made the correct moral and ethical case for, as Prime Minister, allowing a referendum to resolve an issue, but not actually taking a part in it. And of course, that was perceived as weakness on that character. So it's like he'd learned from David Cameron's experience, but then was brought down by another public attitude to referenda. Which again, to me, is very sad. And it does seem to suggest that unless we find a way of re-engineering the political debate in the UK, referenda as a tool are not going to be useful devices.
And to Jeremy Corbyn's credit, he actually at least believes this, which I don't think David Cameron ever really did, but maybe that, again, me being snotty. Anyway, the next question, and speaking of sort of apathy, could the general apathy towards the major two parties, especially following, the others, the thing about the sex scandal, which we discussed earlier, in case of this MP, could be a net gain when it comes to electoral support, whether it be parties like you or some of the other parties that are standing?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I don't know what the turnout's going to be in the Chester by-election. Many people are predicting that it's going to be quite low. And of course, that may benefit some of the minor parties. I would still be pretty shocked if we saw an upset in the actual result at the end of the day from the predictions. But who knows? With a very, very low turnout, anything is possible.
And one thing I want to just make a quick comment on. I do find it a little bit disturbing, or maybe darkly funny, but more like disturbing, to be fair, that this is the second by-election I've covered in a row where the guy had to resign on grounds of sexual misconduct, which doesn't speak very well of our parliament, especially the stuff around the, I think, Pestminster scandals that are currently going on as well.
It's always been thus that sex scandals have brought down MPs. If we think back to the 60s and the Profumo affair and things since then, obviously in the 90s there were quite a few similar issues as well, although obviously the biggest sex scandal of the 90s also involved the MP's death at the same time, which obviously led to a by-election without them resigning. It's not so much a sex scandal that we're seeing now, it's... I'm trying to think of the correct word here.
Perverse?
I'm happy, be perverse in your life. Do what turns you on sexually. It's when you use your power over other people to further your sexual agenda. And that's the dark underbelly that we're seeing exposed now in many of the issues in Parliament. I don't care what any MP does in their private time with consenting adult humans. That is entirely down to them. Or tractors. I'm not particularly bothered by tractors either, for the sake of our Southwest colleague recently departed from Westminster. But it's when you use your power. And this is the problem with the patronage we have in the parliamentary system. MPs are perceived as powerful people. Therefore, they intimidate others. And I'm not even sure it's always intentional on the MP's part, but this has to be stopped. To give you an example, well, not to give you an abstract. If you are a 25-year-old Labour activist that enjoys a drink, likes going out, is popular with friends and colleagues, and you flirt a bit at a nightclub, perhaps everybody thinks, oh, a bit of a lad, that's funny. But when you become a 45-year-old MP, you then have power in that behaviour, and what might have been funny and amusing before is intimidating to the people who are working for you. And that is something that we need to make sure all MPs are aware of.
Mm-hmm. And from there, on the next thing, which is slightly less dark than that, mind you, is that on your campaign website, you discuss about the apathy towards the two parties that we were discussing earlier. You make this more explicit, stating that Labour fails to support a quote-unquote compassionate immigration policy that will benefit the NHS in terms of Labour, and the Tories' failures are not supporting the single market they helped to create in the 80s, among many others. To what extent are such policies in your eyes responsible for the current crises we face? And how many voters in Cheshire do you think share your views on such matters when it comes to the linkage?
That remains to be tested. In terms of things like immigration and the NHS, yes, I was really upset again with Keir Starmer's attitude to that. The people in the NHS, let's be frank, they were heroes over the last 2 years. And perhaps one of the issues in our society is COVID was horrible. It's still with us. People are perceiving that we're moving on. We've got lots of vaccinations, but it's still with us. People don't want to remember 2020 and 2021. They want to push it aside. And by not remembering 2020 and 2021, you stop remembering all the huge sacrifices the staff of the NHS made in order to keep the country going. I mean, those people really were heroes in our society. And now we're back to regarding them as second-class citizens again. So the helpful nurse that helped you 2 years ago is now just another immigrant. And that's something that I think the Labour Party is uniquely positioned to challenge. And I'm very sad that they don't.
Mm-hmm. And they also get real-time pay cuts as well, which makes it even sweeter.
Yeah. And this is the other issue, of course, is the strikes that we see at the moment. Now, we have not had an inflation rate of 10% for a very, very long time. And I think sometimes people forget what an inflation rate of 10% means. If you don't get a wage rise when inflation is 10%, it's not just this year that you're a little bit hard up. That is 10% of your entire future spending power that has gone, unless you then start to catch up and beat inflation in years to come. And so my honest question is, I don't understand why people aren't striking if they are faced with real terms pay cuts that are going to make it very, very hard to live. And again, we go back to Theresa May and her jams. Well, those jams are not going to survive a real terms pay cut without some significant lifestyle choices that's wrong word. It's significant life choices to be made. Do you eat or do you turn on the heating? This is a choice that no one in Britain today should have to make.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because this Truss's response to that sort of thing is essentially, thank goodness we're cutting business rates, which doesn't help the person in the bus, but still. But the next thing I wanted to say on that front is, how do you feel that when there are all these strikes going on, that the government's response isn't to sort of, listen to, unions or the people involved, it's to, take their, striking powers away even further at a time where, just because some of their, I don't mean to sound snotty about this, some of their more wealthier donors and constituents might be annoyed at, the inconvenience.
I think it's getting into dangerous territory, Edward, because every time you take away a legitimate way for people to express their opinions and views, and don't forget, we also have the restrictions on marches and demonstrations now, and the ability to put people in jail for race. And we had the horrific sight of members of the press being arrested for covering the M25 glue downs with no apology, and indeed quite a robust justification from the local PCC on that. I think we're entering a very dangerous time because ultimately society has to make a choice. Are you going to go full throttle for authoritarianism, which is going to undermine democracy in this country if you carry on doing so? Or are you going to make people so angry with what you do that you risk violent upsurge? And let's remember, 2011, which seemed like a much more peaceful time in comparison now, we did have widespread rioting across the country, and people feeling quite nervous about whether this was the moment that society was going to perhaps start to disintegrate. There was a lot of very nervous people in 2011 during the summer there. And quite frankly, I'm surprised that we're not getting back to that sort of area now. And if I was this government, I would think very, very carefully about what is in the long-term interests of my wealthy friends. And I would say if the long-term interests of your wealthy friends is making sure that your less wealthy friends get enough to eat, get warm house, get travel and accommodation to make their lives comfortable, and that is doable within the efficient economic allocation system that we do have at our disposal.
Mm-hmm. I lived for those 2011 riots, so I know what you mean, actually. And one minor detail quickly. This is something we discussed earlier, but I didn't manage to get around to it, so I think I might as well touch on it now. You discussed how you live in the Barnet area of London. How does that, how are you going to be able to court voters in Chester, given that you live such a far away? How does that, what can someone from Barnet offer of the people of Chester?
Well, I think what any MP could offer the people of Chester, democratic representation and an ability to actually have your voice heard in Parliament. But there is a other side to the reason that I'm standing in Chester. There are many, many local people in Chester who do want us to stand a candidate. But you have to remember that a by-election is a bit like a circus. And when the circus leaves town, the people who stay behind are left with those consequences. So what I think a number of people feel nervous about is standing as a local candidate for Rejoin EU in Chester, and then we'll all come and knock on doors and support you during the election campaign. And when we're gone, anyone who does have a bit of an axe to grind with pro-EU people know who they are, know where they live, so to speak. So that's one of the reasons why sometimes a candidate from outside the area can be very useful. And do recall, I don't want to remind of specifics, but there have been acts of violence towards people who have been promoting being pro-EU, and a lot of people on my side of the debate, particularly in the Rejoin EU Party, remember that and are a bit nervous about putting their heads above the parapet and potentially having to face that down.
Mm-hmm. Sorry to hear that. And one of the final questions I wanted to ask you is that if you lose this by-election, what do you plan for your political future and for the Rejoin EU Party as a whole?
Well, obviously, Edward, I can't imagine that I'm going to lose the by-election. But the key thing out of this by-election is going to see how many votes we can actually get. It's the absolute number of votes that we will be focusing on here. We want people to use our label to be able to send a message that rejoining the EU is a solution that should be considered to our current economic, social and socio-economic woes. That's what I hope the people of Chester will use. And of course, there's going to be 2 by-elections coming up relatively soon after Chester in the new year. So we will look at the results from Chester and consider at that stage what our next steps should be.
Mm-hmm.
Onwards and upwards for 3 MPs rather than 1 at that stage.
Forgive me for sounding slightly stupid, but which was the other by-election? Because I know one of the other ones is West Lancashire because Rosie Cooper's standing down. Is the other one related to Nadine Dorries, but possibly becoming a lord?
No. Oh, okay. Manchester. One of the MPs in Manchester is standing down to become deputy mayor in Manchester. So that's where the second by-election will be.
I see. Thank you for.
I get a feeling that Ms. Dorothy's plans for elevated office have been somewhat put on hold now. So
Mhm. Maybe she should go back on I'm a Celebrity, but her colleagues there, so that might take some time. But
well, it has to be said that seems to be the way to get government policy out these days. I'm surprised we don't have competing ministers down there trying to give different views.
give it time, I suppose. But thank you for coming on. That was an interesting discussion. And for those who want to know more about you and your campaign, where can they find you? And yeah, what is your social media links?
Well, obviously, the major one is the party one at Rejoin P on Twitter. So do join us there, as well as the rejoineuparty.com online. Those are our main two channels. We also have a YouTube channel as well. Just Google Rejoin EU YouTube and you'll get to our YouTube channel. Our Facebook presence is building as well. And anyone who wants to challenge me personally on any of the things I've said, feel free to use my personal Twitter at Richard Hewison. I call it my personal Twitter. I tend to talk, I think about 95% of what I talk about is politics. So anyone welcome to put some views there.
Yeah, hopefully a lot more friendly hopefully more friendly than some of the horror stuff you've had to deal with. So
generally, yes, I have to say on Twitter, which is surprising. We get occasional negatives, but not very many.
Thank you for coming on once again, and have a good evening.
And you. Take care. Thank you for your time.
Thanks for watching. If you like that and want to see more, please like and subscribe, as well as share. For longer episodes of the show with exclusive content, check out the audio versions of these podcasts, which are linked in the description below. If you would like to recommend guests, as well as get some other exclusive perks related to the show, please consider subscribing to both my Patreon and or subscribe to Scarlet accounts, as linked in the description below as well. And I hope to see you next time. Have a good day.